Republic, this is one of the banks that was in trouble. So recently, I believe it was like a month ago, we talked about what happened with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Then later on, there was issues with Signature Bank. And in between there was also another bank that was mentioned called First Republic Bank. Now, they've kind of flown under the radar when you compare them to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. I felt like that bank received a lot more attention than First Republic Bank. But that's unfortunate because First Republic Bank right now is about to be taken over by the FDIC. I kid you not. So we should have paid attention to this. Here we go.
More breaking financial news. First Republic Bank will be seized by the FDIC. That's according to Reuters. This after deciding it's too late for any more rescue efforts by the private sector. Joining us now to break this all down here on Live Now from Fox, editor-in-chief of the Kobasi Letter, Adam Kobasi. He joins us now on this Friday. Adam, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. You've been following this story really all day. It's breaking right now, and it's developing quite quickly. What do you think this means at this moment going into the weekend for the San Francisco-based lender First Republic?
Yeah, I mean, we've been following this story since day one when this all began in early March. And this is very similar to what we saw with SVB, Silicon Valley Bank. They waited until the Friday and now they're seizing the bank. And over the weekend, we expect to receive a lot of news about whether or not all these deposits above the FDIC insured limit are going to be backstopped, which we believe they will. And I mean, we've been calling for a while now that all the bank deposits need to be backstopped temporarily, regardless of size, just to stop this. This is the product of human behavior, and it could have been avoided because FRC really was a great bank.
Okay.
So you notice that this bank is also located in the San Francisco area, just like Silicon Valley Bank. They're in that area, like San Francisco, Silicon Valley, like that region there. Now, so the FDIC has announced that they are going to take over First Republic Bank. Now, this is another one of those regional banks. Other people are trying to step in and see if they can actually take over that bank. But I want to bring this up because I want to remind you that when that collapse happened with Silicon Valley Bank, we were told by mainstream media that we really shouldn't panic, that this was not going to be anything like 2008, that we were not going to see a domino effect. And then shortly after Silicon Valley Bank, it was Signature Bank. And then after Signature Bank, it was First Republic Bank. So I'm kind of sitting here like, who's next, right? Who wants next? I don't know. But we can't sleep on this. You know, I get a little antsy about failing banks because it does take me back to 2008. And I just want to make sure that we're continuing to cover this because this is another failed bank. Let's go on a little bit more.
So if it's going into an imminent receivership, and does that essentially mean government control? Is the government going to imminently take over First Republic's assets?
Yep, that's correct. So basically what happens is the FDIC, which is a regulator, will step in and they seize the bank. And what has to be decided now is any deposits above the $250,000 threshold, which is what all deposits are insured up to in the U.S., it has to be decided what's going to happen with those. And just like we saw with Silicon Valley Bank, we're expecting a very similar procedure here where the Fed and the FDIC will back all of these deposits. But it's going to be probably, now it's going to be a question of what happens with the assets at the bank. And it's probably going to be another auction type process like we saw with Silicon Valley Bank.
But notice what he said about banking the deposits over $250K. This was the same thing with Silicon Valley Bank. Now, typically, who has deposits of like $250,000? Typically wealthy people, right? Most middle-class people don't have that. Poor people don't have that. Working class people don't have that. So anyone who has deposits under that $250,000, I don't know what happens to their deposits, but this is similar to Silicon Valley Bank, where they only seem to want to protect or are going to protect the deposits that are $250K and up. Jessica says First Republic was purchased by Merrill Lynch for $1.8 billion in September 2007. The New York-based brokerage firm ran First Republic as a separate unit, maintaining its name and management, BOA bought on January 1st. So that BOA, I think, is Bank of America. That's interesting to note as well. I'm going to play a little bit more here, and then I have another clip that I want to show you in reference to, is this a sign that we have just a First Republic bank problem, just a regional bank problem, or do we have both that and a banking crisis?
To get these assets transferred into someone else's hand, because the government doesn't want to hold them indefinitely, of course.
Yeah, Adam, the banking sector, the government seemed to have put out all the stops. They went to great lengths to prevent, the run with the customers in the interim, since we saw SVB and other banks collapse there. It doesn't seem like those efforts worked. If you do business with First Republic, if you have your deposits there, what are you thinking right now on this Friday afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you have deposits under the 250,000 limit, then you're not even, there's nothing to worry about. You're insured by the FDIC. You're good to go. If you're
Okay, so those people are insured by the FDIC.
Above the limit, that's where it becomes a little bit dicey. But it's again, we think all these backstops are going to be, or these deposits are going to be backstopped, especially because we had that injection of about 30 billion in deposits from a few large banks back in March. Those large banks are now, of course, above that 250,000 limit. And if the government were to let all of these loans or these deposits collapse, it would send ripple effects through the banking sector. So we are very confident that some sort of a backstop will likely come out of this.
Yep.
Okay. Now, once again, there is this concept of the government possibly trying to bail out the banks. But that may not even be necessary when it comes to this particular bank, because JPMorgan is actually interested in bailing out this bank. Listen to this, and this wouldn't be the first time. JPMorgan, PNC bidding for First Republic as part of FDIC takeover. Seizure and sale of the distressed lender could come as soon as this weekend. That's today. I think today was the deadline, if I remember correctly. Big banks, including JPMorgan Chase & Co. and PNC Financial Services Group, are vying to buy First Republic Bank in a deal that would follow a government seizure of the troubled lender. According to people familiar with the matter, a seizure of sale of First Republic by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation could come as soon as this weekend, people said. And like I said, I think today was the deadline. San Francisco-based bank has teetered for weeks following the March 10 failure of fellow Bay Area lender Silicon Valley Bank. The SVB meltdown spurred panicky First Republic customers to pull around $100 billion in deposits in a matter of days. So when this incident happened with Silicon Valley Bank, you had customers at First Republic Bank freak out and say, uh-oh, let me get my money up out of here. So let's go on. A group of the nation's biggest banks, including JPMorgan and PNC, tried to shore up First Republic with a $30 billion deposit, but it wasn't enough. First Republic considered a sale or outside capital injection and hired investment bankers to advise on its options. The Wall Street Journal has reported. It's also floated a plan to sell some of its loans or securities or both at prices above market value. A seizure and sale of First Republic would cap the astonishing collapse of a lender that was, until recently, the envy of finance. With some $233 billion in assets at the end of the first quarter, it would be the second largest bank to fail in U.S. history. This is huge. A First Republic spokesman declined to comment, of course. An FDIC spokeswoman declined to comment. So neither one of them want to talk about this. First Republic released a dismal quarterly earnings report Monday that gave new details about the extent of the damage from the deposit run. The bank said it filled the hole from fleeing depositors with expensive loans from the Federal Reserve and Federal Home Loan Bank. That left the lender facing a future where it would potentially pay more on its liabilities than it earned on its assets. The earnings report sent the bank stock down nearly 50% in one day. Yikes. It continued to tumble as the week went on and closed at 3.4051 a share on Friday, down from 115 on March 8th. That's my birthday. That's my birthday. The day SVB disclosed a loss that spooked investors and customers. The banking industry turmoil began when customers with balances exceeding the $250,000 deposit insurance limit grew concerned in March about the health of a handful of mid-sized banks and pulled out their money in mass. New York-based Signature Bank failed days after SVB's collapse. Regulators and bankers hoped the panic had eased after the government stepped in to make uninsured depositors at SVB and Signature Bank whole. But First Republic's badly damaged balance sheet left it with a few good options. And we're going to go down here. JPMorgan and Pittsburgh-based PNC both have a history of stepping into the breach during crisis. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. JPMorgan, why is that there? JPMorgan bought ailing Bear Stearns in 2008, then took on Washington Mutual's incorporated operations after it was seized by the government. This goes to show you just how much money JPMorgan has, that they can just step in and buy banks that fail. And this isn't a new thing for them. We're going to go back to 1907 and talk about how JPMorgan actually became the Bank of Wall Street, or basically bought Wall Street. They've been doing this for a while. This is not a new thing, but that goes to tell you how much money JPMorgan has. Now, this piece here, Chief Executive Jamie Dimon, who's featured on the thumbnail, paralyzed his crisis management into a statesman role among bank executives. He is the longest serving CEO of the biggest U.S. banks in the role since 2005 and regularly uses his perch to advise government officials and promote policy moves he says will help the economy. He was a key force behind the $30 billion big bank deposit that kept First Republic afloat in the early days of the banking panic. He later tried to rally his fellow CEOs to craft a new rescue plan for the troubled bank, suggesting that they could convert some or all of their deposits into a capital infusion. During the 2008 financial crisis, yes, I'm sorry to take you back there, but we got to do it. During the 2008 financial crisis, PNC bought ailing Cleveland lender National City Corp with government assistance. That deal made PNC one of the largest regional banks in the U.S. It was the nation's sixth largest bank at the end of last year. Okay. There is something that could have prevented a lot of this, and that is having a public bank. Because you see, during the 2008 crisis, there is one state that did not struggle the way that other states did in this country, and that is North Dakota. North Dakota didn't struggle because North Dakota has a public bank. It's called the Bank of North Dakota. This has existed since like the 1800s, so it's not a new thing. If more of these cities like San Francisco and the Silicon Valley area, all the cities in this country actually, if people actually invested more in establishing public banks, we could avoid some of this mess. And that's the reason why I brought people on to talk about public banking. There was a gentleman that came on that's in Philadelphia. He's with an organization there. They're trying to start a public bank in Philadelphia. Now, it's not as easy to do it for the state nowadays, but you can do it probably easier by the city. So those of you who are here with me in Boston, if we wanted to, we could try to find a way to get a public bank in Boston. Doesn't have to be the public bank for the whole state, but that is one way to prevent this from happening. Now, but the question is this just a First Republic problem? Is it just a Silicon Valley Bank problem? Is this just a Signature Bank problem? Or is this the sign of a banking crisis once again? Listen to this.
Good morning. Happy
Do
to
we
be here.
have a First Republic problem or a banking problem?
Well, I think we have both, and I think it's somewhat naive to say that this is just limited to First Republic. If you step back and think about it, this should never have happened. This went after the most heavily regulated, capitalized industry on the planet, banking. And the regional banking system, I think, is quite vital to the U.S. So I think it is a crisis. I think the regional banks are heavily dependent on the FDIC. They're heavily dependent on the Federal Home Loan Bank to get additional cash. We don't know how they're going to operate when those two programs expire.
Is it a crisis that is ring-fenced, so to speak, or is it a crisis that bleeds out to the broader economy and leads to a credit crunch?
Does this crisis bleed out to the broader economy? And I want to point out something that he mentioned earlier on. Remember when that collapse happened of too many banks collapsing, of Silicon Valley Bank. Remember they said that this was not going to be a domino effect. And what did I tell you guys? I was like, I don't know about that. I'll wait to see. And then after that, it was Signature Bank. And then we have First Republic Bank. So sometimes you just have to wait and see if these things are going to happen instead of, I think what they tried to do was calm the nerves of the American people so that people would not become afraid and fearful like people were in 2008. But you have to be honest with the people.
It's ring-fenced as long as there's continuous progress to some sort of resolution. And I actually don't think the savings and loan industry back in the late 80s, early 90s is the wrong thing to look at. Some sort of consolidation, some sort of agencies, a technical assistance committee at the FDIC or the Fed to help these regional banks when they see a surge in depositor inflows or outflows, or when they see an asset liability problem. Those are the kinds of things that you need. But I think what we've actually seen is that the deposit outflows just didn't occur because they occurred. They occurred because businesses and households are burning cash in a big way. And it's the higher price of everything, and it's the higher cost to finance everything. So if you're in the couple lower quintiles of earners in the U.S., we're already seeing in the Chase data that you're depleting your deposit balances because of the higher cost of groceries just to live. And businesses, as they're rolling over their floating rate funding, it's double or triple what they put it on.
Okay, this is the third point that hasn't been discussed.
Did everybody catch what he said there? How he tried to put the blame on us? Listen to this piece right here. This is why I wanted to play this clip. He was okay in the beginning, and then he lost me right about here.
Or outflows, or when they see an asset liability problem. Those are the kinds of things that you need. But I think what we've actually seen is that the deposit outflows just didn't occur because they occurred. They occurred because businesses and households are burning cash in a big way. And
businesses and households are burning cash in a big way. It's our fault, guys. We're burning cash. It's always our fault. Really? That's interesting. I think people who are working class and people who are poor and people who are lower middle class, I don't think they're burning through cash right now. I think they're trying to hold on to as much as they have because the prices are high. He goes on to mention the prices are high.
it's the higher price of everything, and it's the higher cost to finance everything. So if you're in the couple...
Okay, so he admits that the prices are high. So if the prices are high, I don't think people are going out there spending more. I think, for example, if you go to the grocery store, you know the grocery store prices are still high, right? How many of you are still buying as many groceries as you were 2 years ago? How many? I'm not. I'm buying a little at a time, actually. Little at a time. How many of you? And this is the case for a lot of people that are spoken to. They're not buying as many groceries as they were 2 years ago. They're buying less because the prices are high. But the way he explains it, he makes it sound like it's our fault because we're just going out, just blowing our money. We're spending like crazy. It always comes back to us instead of blaming the real issue.
lower quintiles of earners in the U.S., we're already seeing in the Chase data that you're depleting your deposit balances because of the higher cost of groceries just to live, and businesses, as they're rolling over their floating rate funding, it's double or triple what they put it on.
Okay, this is the third point that hasn't been discussed enough. Point one is worries about return of capital. You take it out of a beleaguered financial institution, park it somewhere else. Point two is about return on capital. You take it out of a bank, give it to a money market fund. You're on to point three. You're saying that there's that much pain out there right now that we're just burning through money in the United States.
Of course we are. When you look at, you could look at our own Chase data, you could look at the Federal Reserve Board data, you see that the bottom quintile of earners have been most punished by the high price of everything. So that excess savings that they accumulated during the CARES Act, they've blown right through it. Their deposit balances are below where they went into COVID. Now,
what excess savings? He's talking about, he said people who are at the very bottom, and he's like, well, they burn through that excess savings. What savings? See, I think this is where people, this guy's very smart. Okay. That's why they bring him on. Okay. But I don't think he understands that when he talks about the extra money that people received during the pandemic, in his mind, he actually believes that money went into a savings account for poor people. He said the people at the bottom. He doesn't understand that for a lot of people in that particular situation, that money went to bills. That money went to catch people up on rent because some people were behind on rent. That money went to turn people's lights back on. He honestly thinks that money went into a savings account. This is the class divide. Say it again, Simone. Simone goes, how long is 1,400 going to last? Right. Like, this is not even for me, like, when I got the stimulus check, I was just like, okay. Now, luckily, I wasn't laid off. But for people that I know that were laid off or they lost their business, their small businesses, that money went to bills. That money didn't go into a savings account. So I get it. You have to bring on someone who's a finance expert. I get that. But now he's trying to basically gaslight the audience and make them believe that the American people who are lower class received so much money from the federal government during the pandemic that they were actually able to put it into savings. No. No. That's a class issue. That's a class divide. Now, I told you that JPMorgan wants to step in. They want to be the ones to save the day. And I told you this is not the first time that they've done this. We want to go back to the panic of 1907. And I want to explain to you how JPMorgan took over Wall Street, because it wasn't always that way. And then I'm going to tell you my issue with JPMorgan. So let's go ahead and dive into this. The consolidation of financial power is almost always a harbinger for the rise or fall of the New York's future. And no event was more exemplary of this effect than the little-known panic of 1907. And no man amassed so much power from it than JPMorgan. Now, this is the individual JPMorgan. Okay? So it was one man that had that much power. Commonly known story of the Panic of 1907 is that in October 1907, an attempt by F. Augustus Hines, an overzealous Wall Street banker, to corner the copper market led to a run on many major banks. The effects of the run caused a panic that reverberated throughout Wall Street, New York City banks, and ultimately many of the U.S. banking and manufacturing industries. At the height of the panic, JPMorgan stepped in to aid the banking community and quell the massive drop in bank reserves and market collapse. He was touted by many Americans as a true patriot and selfless beacon of financial hope for the country. But To those who rigidly examine his actions, he was a monster who fed off of the demise of economic destruction. Yes, because let me tell you what he did. He volunteered to come in and help those banks. But in doing so, he took over those banks. It wasn't like he wasn't really trying to help them. He was trying to gain that more power for himself. And this is how JPMorgan became to be like this big conglomerate it is today. This is how this started. So I want to show you this piece here. Let me go down to this part because I want to tell you a little bit more detail what he did. With increasing shares in decreasing markets, industrial monopolization, over-leveraged capital, debt, and other dark conditions, the panic of 1907 began long before F. Augustus Hines' October run on copper, and as the ice began to crack under Wall Street, JPMorgan was under it waiting to attack. According to JPMorgan and Co.'s records, the panic of 1907, which drew out over the last 3 weeks in October of that year, proceeded as follows. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'll put the link in the chat for you to read. But I want to get to what happened at the end. Doot, 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 doot. Let me go down here. Sorry. Boop. I'm just making sure I got to the right part. I don't want to skip. Doot, 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 doot. Okay, here we go. As the panic got underway, Morgan formed a committee to determine which institutions could be saved after the panic and which ones could be sacrificed. You see how this works? He had no intentions to actually save all of them. The committee answered to 3 men, JPMorgan, George F. Baker, and James Stillman. At the end of countless hours of examination and committee recommendations, 3 banks were left off the list to save: Hamilton Bank, the 12th Ward Bank, and the Empire City Savings Bank. All 3 banks were in Harlem. Imagine that. Let's go on. As Harlem was hit hard by the lack of attempts to aid the area, Brooklyn was hit even harder by the failure to carry out the intended aid. First National Bank of Brooklyn, Williamsburg Trust Company of Brooklyn, Borough Bank of Brooklyn, and the Jenkins Trust Company of Brooklyn all failed. This is the piece you need to note about here. Then the takeovers immediately began. Morgan swooped in and absorbed Mercantile Trust and 6 more trust companies and banks, including the 2 largest banks that were hit the hardest, the Trust Company of America and Lincoln Trust. Morgan's Guarantee Trust and Manhattan Trust Companies would control them with the Rothschild family. U.S. Embassy, August Belmont at the helm of the merger. He promised Charles Barney that he would help to save the Knickerbocker Trust, but decided to pull the plug at the last minute. Soon after that, Barney committed suicide. Banks in other cities began to fail. Banks in Providence, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh sought aid. JPMorgan's approximated private pool of about $30 million included a $10 million loan from John D. Rockefeller. Publicly, Morgan railed the working people of America for trying to rescue their own money from the teeth of Wall Street greed. So this is history for JPMorgan. This is what they've done. While JPMorgan was ordering the public to keep cool heads, and he and his Wall Street cohort were charging massive interest rates on their bailout loans, it was payback time. Morgan called the collateral on the loans he gave to his old advisory, C.W. Morse. He used the collateralized bonds I said bonds. He used the collateralized bonds to acquire Morse's Consolidated Steamship Company, which was his competitor in the sector as well, as Morgan owned the International Mercantile Marine Company, the parent company of the famous Titanic White Star Lines. So as you can see, like, this is a long article, but long story short, they've done this before. And that's how JP Morgan became as big as it is now. That was the start of it. Now, here's my problem. As many times as you're hearing about people talk about JP Morgan and this banking crisis, just like we just went through here, they are very silent about the fact that JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, that they have been subpoenaed in reference to their business dealings with Jeffrey Epstein. And to talk about this, like, to seriously, just to bring them up at this point in time and to talk about this and just say, oh, well, Jamie Dimon, Google Jamie Dimon right now. Google Jamie Dimon and you'll see nothing but just great things. Oh, Jamie Dimon is coming to try to help a bank. This is so great for him to do. Da, 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 da. And none of these media outlets are talking about the fact that he's been subpoenaed in reference to finance dealings with Jeffrey Epstein, because Jeffrey Epstein had JP Morgan as his bank and used that bank to fund all of that mess that was happening at his private island in the Virgin Islands. And they're not even mentioning it. They're talking about Jamie Dimon right now like he's a saint. And it's disgusting. There's more about Epstein that's coming. I was going to try to talk about it today, but I don't think I'm going to have time. But there's more information that has just been released about Jeffrey Epstein, and somebody that a lot of you like too. And I don't know how to tell you, because some of you are not going to be happy when you hear about it. If you're not on Twitter, you probably have not heard about it. Some of you are going to be very upset, very upset. But that's why you can't have this hero worship. I'll take that comment on Rockfin, Eric. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. Sab Earl Steelen, chair of Rocky Mount Public Banking Institution, wrote white paper on why FDIC not needed for a public bank. The requirements of FDIC membership and 100% collateral for uninsured public deposits were established solely with private banks in mind. The FDIC completely is unnecessary for public banks that follow the Bank of North Dakota model and would substantially undermine their probability. I think that's what you mean. There's a question mark there. And effectiveness. CB 14, public banks. Yes, indeed. Eric says, better put all your money in Second Republic Bank. I don't know. I don't know. Lawrence says Wall Street is a giant legalized casino. That's a good way to refer to it. And thank you for the super chat, Mary. Hey, chat room from Wisconsin. All right. Land of cheese.